Hey, how's it going, everybody? I'm Ben from Universal Audio, and welcome back to yet another Office Hours. We're happy to be back. It's good to be back in this, regular Monday time slot yet again. We've got a really fun show for you guys today. We're talking all about bus compressors. We're going to talk about a lot of the mistakes that we experience, that we see other people doing. We're going to kind of give you guys some tips and tricks to get the best settings, and most importantly, kind of how to choose between the plethora of bus compressors that are available to us these days. But thankfully, you guys don't have to just hear it from me the whole time, because we've got Drew and Matt along with us. How you guys doing today?
Good, man. How are you?
Awesome.
Nice. Well, guys, I mean, number one question. This not just for you guys here with me, but also everybody in the chat. Let's get it out in the open. Everybody, what's your favorite bus compressor? Just if you had to pick only one to take with you to use on every mix from now to the end of time, Drew, which one would you pick?
Oh my God, man! I didn't know you were going to ask me that, Ben. So only one bus compressor, no matter what. I mean, I guess it has to be the SSL. I mean, I guess it has to be the SSL G bus, just because it's a classic. I mean, it doesn't have some of the variability and some of the options that other ones have, but somehow I feel like it's always just the one. It's always going to work for me. I feel like it'll always work for me. So I guess if you push me, I'd have to say that.
All right, SSL G. Matt, what would you go for?
I want to pick something else for diversity, but I'll be honest. SSLG would be my pick too. Except for
hard.
2-bus. Yeah, if I'm talking about 2-bus, then I'd say Shadow Hills. But yeah, SSLG is definitely the one I reach for the most. I just like the spank that it gives things.
Mm-hmm. All right. I mean, I made up the question. I said only one. I would love to cheat and say I'm going to take 3 with me, but because I can't do a mix without the SSL. But the one that for me has definitely done the most, kind of adds that little extra polish that you do get with the SSL, but it's a different type of polish. The Manly Varimu, that one, the way it kisses tracks is absolutely perfect. So I'm reading through the chat here. We got 33609 easy for Bjorn, 2500 SSL, a 176 on the mix bus.
Interesting.
Bold choice, sir.
That is bold.
I fully appreciate how bold of a choice that is. We got G bus, a 610, not necessarily a compressor, but a great mix bus processor. Vertigo VSC2 API 2500. Yeah, we're all swimming in the same pool here, guys. This is bus compressors. The thing I love about them, and this is it's integral to my mixing process, is mixing into them and having this little compressor that's pushing against everything you feed into it. And for me, it really helps kind of shape the balance of the mix. It just makes that whole job that much easier. I remember, and maybe this is a bit of beginner's memory here, but I remember when I first started, I didn't really know how to use bus. I was a little intimidated. I thought that they were just for mastering. So I would mix with no bus compressors, as little processing as possible. I remember that mixing being very difficult. And then when I started getting comfortable mixing into these things, it started getting easier and easier. Cause and effect, I don't know. But I can certainly tell you, for me and my process, it's 100% where everything starts is on the mix bus. Start there, and then I work my way backwards. Getting more, just checking chat here again, checking for some more votes. More SSL, Shadow Hills, yep, 2500 SSL, Fairchild 670, good one.
Yeah.
And Drew, apparently
I know.
King Lion is requesting you need to grow a beard.
Yeah, I know. I'm really I was feeling a little self-conscious now, but now I'm really self-conscious.
Well, guys, let's get into kind of checking out these compressors. But before we do that, real quick, we are trying some new segments out, and one of those new segments is where we're gonna pull up comments from the last week on videos or on social media and otherwise, and check out what you guys are saying. Besides, the live chat, obviously, you guys are here with us live. You guys are the best. But after the fact, there's also some incredible comments that come through. Last week we highlighted the Instagram meme thread. This week we've got a lot of great comments coming in over on our YouTube channel. So let me share my screen here. This first one, it's just an obvious pick for a top comment. This dude is awesome. Looking at a photo of me. Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Terry said, "Cool, I didn't even know this mode existed. Definitely be using it." And that was the Luna Basics. This is Drew. Congratulations, you're published Luna Basics.
Well, I had one before. I had ARM mode, so this was my second one.
Second one. Number two.
Yeah,
this is
number two.
This is your most impactful one because console tracking mode. I know you've been a huge user and fan of that mode, so I'm glad that we finally have a Luna. Because I even saw in other comments similar to Terry's, people didn't know this existed, and it's
so
super
many
powerful.
people. Yeah, so many people didn't know it was know that it existed, and the examples I give in that video are super. They're very handy, and and they kind of really great if you're tracking with other musicians and so forth. So if you haven't checked out the Luna Basics CTM video, then definitely watch it. And let me know what you think in the comments there, or come over to the forum uadforum.com, and if you have any follow-up questions or what have you. But yeah, it was great to get that one out the door. So, and thanks to Matt for his help there, his editing prowess there.
Nice. We got from the Joe Ciccarelli mixing hip hop drums, JA Music Group saying, "I love that trick. I'm addicted to multiple parallel compression." Yes, that video is it's really rad. I saw other people commenting like, I haven't seen Ciccarelli necessarily work on hip hop stuff like that before, but I love how he brings. He's not necessarily a super known hip hop engineer. He's just kind of known as like a great mixing, Grammy winning engineer.
Yeah, I was going to say, first thing, if you don't know the name, Google it and just read, and then comment on his video after you've read up on his career.
Yeah, Joe's an actual beast, and it's so cool to see his techniques there and kind of how he's able to add drive and add push and some of the similar stuff that we're going to talk about a little bit here on today's show as well. But Joe really goes in on the parallel compression aspect of it. Another one, we had a sidechain episode that was last week, and Trackhouse, great to have the Office Hours crew back, and thanks for the show. And the new segments are fun. Thumbs up. That's why we'll keep doing them. And this last one, I'm not 100% sure if this one's a joke or if they're serious. I found it pretty humorous. Jay Webster's again about sidechain input. No, not sidechain. It's the effect made to ruin music and chase customers away. Music producers and engineers are the only people obsessed with this effect. Every other human being, as a music enthusiast in the world, hates this effect with every fiber of their being. Music production is on a downward spiral. Thumbs up if you agree that we're on a downward spiral. Everybody in the chat.
People have been saying that. People said that when the car came out and it was going to replace the horse, right? They were like, "Oh, these damn cars, these newfangled cars." I
know, right? Nice. Well, so that's some of our top comments. Unfortunately, Studio Showdown is going to be suspended for this week due to there's a bit of an outage going on with Instagram and Facebook this week. So Studio Showdown, a little bit. It's affecting just about everybody. So we're not going to do a Studio Showdown segment. We're just going to get straight into our content here about bus compressors. And we were thinking, what are some fun, interesting ways to really kind of talk about bus compressors, and most importantly, get you guys ideas to explore bus compressors a little bit further and how you use them for your mixes. I think there's a couple trains of thought, and we're going to kind of explore both of them. There's one school. It says you should just use a little bit, just a little dabble do, right? A little, just kiss the meter a little bit. That's one thought process. That's how I like to work with it. There's a lot of other folks who really love to be heavy-handed with bus compressors, right? They love to really, it should always be working, and it should be going from like a little bit of work to a lot of work, and you should really be making an impact with that compressor, really driving into it. We'll show what that sounds like and talk about some of the pluses and minuses about that. And then most importantly, we're going to get into like the settings that matter the most. We're going to have a little discussion about, what's the difference between mixed bus processing and compression versus like, should you leave this stuff for the mastering engineer? Should you take this stuff off? We'll get into all that. And then we're going to talk a bunch about kind of the mistakes that we hear people make and give you guys some tips for how to pick, asked at the top of the show, which one's everyone's favorite bus compressor. There's so many choices out there, but there are some really important things for you guys to think about as you're choosing which bus compressor to use for a mix. So we got a lot to talk about. We got a lot to dive into. So I'll kind of lead us off here and show you guys an example of using the bus compressors to just shave a little bit, just add a little bit of motion, add a little bit of glue to the music. And to show you guys this, I'm share my screen. So I've got this. This is a client mix. So this is a very developed 2-bus chain here. This is one I use very often. I'm actually cheating a little bit here, guys. I'm using 2 bus compressors. I've got the API 2500, then I'm going into the Brainworks EQ, and then I'm going into the SSL G bus, then into a massive passive, and then finally into my limiters. So this is what you guys will see is you'll see I'm doing a little bit with each, making each compressor do just the minimal amount of work. But it is one of those things, and this is probably my biggest tip for using bus compressors, is that this isn't necessarily about level management. This is not, don't think of these things as like, oh man, these are going to be what gets my mixes to sound louder. This is what, this is what makes them, come sound better on radio or blah, blah, blah. These are really tone boxes. And so I really want you guys to listen to is like, there's not going to be a huge level shift. There's not going to be a gigantic dynamic shift happening here, but listen to like the mid range, listen to the tone of the record and see how that shifts. Even when I take just one of these compressors out, you're going to feel the difference in the snare drum and the guitars and the vocals. Everything kind of shifts around when I take these out of the path. So I'll just play back the chorus here a couple times. I'll switch them in and out. And everybody in the comments, I want to hear from you guys what you're hearing, what you're feeling is the difference. Because it's level wise, it should only be a dB or two, and I've got these pretty well matched. But listen tonally, what do you feel like is changing in the mix as I'm taking these in and out? Let's check it out. So that's the SSL in and out. Let me do the same thing real quick with the 2500. You guys picking up what I'm putting down there? Like it's a little bit of a lift. It's a little like step forward with these 2 compressors going on and off. Matt, Drew, you guys hearing that difference coming through on the headphones?
Yeah, for sure. That's one thing. That's one of the things I think that people need to. That sometimes it's a little bit of a bitter pill to swallow, and that is, especially when you're talking hardware. You spend all this money on hardware, you hook it up, and you're super excited, and you get it in on that hardware insert, and then you toggle that $4,000 mix bus compressor on and off, and it's like, whoa. That I paid $4,000 for that. Yeah, that's kind of how it's just like it's like that density and that glue and harmonic shaper really. Like the fundamentals coming together with the top end. All pulling it together.
Mm-hmm. Totally, and I see folks in the chat here both saying it's bringing forward the mids. Yike is saying it thickens up the mids. Yeah, this is the kind of the advantage of using these bus compressors. And again, not trying to use these are not where I'm getting loudness. Like loudness is a combination of a lot of things and a topic for a whole different episode. And that's not really the point of using these bus compressors. They're tone machines. And, I'll quickly touch on my settings here and the couple that I really want to point out to you guys. And we'll talk a lot about this in this episode. Like what are the most important settings for bus compressors? A lot of it, it's going to be attack, ratio, release. Those are kind of your big ones. The threshold is always variable. It depends on how you're gain staging into your compressor. But you'll notice, I've got the API 2500, it's set to 1.5. I've got my SSL set to 2. It was on 4 when I started working on this mix today. But we'll leave it at 2 because that's what you guys heard. Notice the attack. I've got 10 and 10 on both of them. The release, we're on the fastest release, and I've got the API set to variable, which means I gotta pull this open here. And now with variable, you can see I've got it on its fastest release. So really what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get these compressors to be as out of the way as possible, as transparent as possible, low ratio, kind of an open attack, really fast release, really trying to, add that little bit of shape and a little bit of tone. And, so someone was asking if everything in the mix is running through these, and yes, this is the final main bus on my mix. So this is all the tracks all added together, and And this is something I think, Matt, you were going to highlight here in a bit too. Like, bus compressors are not just all about the main bus. Like, you'll notice throughout my mix, almost all of my different buses, like my lead vocal bus, it's got bus compression, right? It's got a 2500 and an LA2A to kind of. So I'm doing this work stage by stage, group by group, and adding a little bit here, there, adding a little bit on each track. On the drums, obviously, I'm running a parallel path here with the main drums going through a 2500. Again, just a little bit more aggressive settings, but then also a parallel path with the DBX 160. So it's kind of like by taking these little bites of compression throughout the mix and not having to slam it on the end of my signal chain. Those compressors they're not having to do a ton of work. They're not having to like really dive into the sound. They're able to kind of just complement it and add a little bit more of that presence and energy, which is really what I'm looking for. But man, that's a great way to talk about. So that's an example of, subtle, just a hint, just a little bit of a dance. Let's talk about being heavy-handed. Let's swing the exact other way. And Matt, have you got an example here that we can show of some aggressive bus compression?
Yeah, totally. So I got Jakir's mission session pulled up that he did for us, and he has a really good example of kind of aggressive drum bus compression. So yeah, this is definitely an example of bus compression on an individual instrument bus rather than the two bus. But it's a good way it kind of illustrates a good way to get things to sit together well before you send them to the master, before you start mixing them with everything else. And again, it's he's got a lot of compression going on and adds a lot of tone and vibe to it. So yeah, let's take a listen to what's going on here. I'm just going to solo the drum bus just with Jakir's original settings, and you'll see there's a lot of compression going on. Let's take a listen to what that sounds like. So yeah, it's kind of a real raw, kind of almost dirty tone to it. And one of the cool things that one of the smart things that Jakir did when setting this up is really the release setting. And it really goes to show how important the release setting is when you're doing heavy compression like this. You'll notice whenever like the kick and the snare hit, there's like 12 to 14 dB of compression happening. There's a lot of compression happening. But then when the snare and the kick aren't hitting, it kind of drops down to more 1 or 2 and even completely goes away. So what you end up, and he has this snare sample going in with the AKG BX20 on it, which is where a lot of that kind of pseudo room tone is coming from. So what ends up happening is you get a lot of compression when the kick and snare hit, and then when the kick and snare back off, this kind of AKG BX20 pseudo room tone thing kind of pumps up. So you get this cool kind of pumping in rhythm with the kick and snare. So let me play that again. Yeah, you can kind of hear after those really loud drum hits hit, the room tone kind of swells up, or the reverb kind of swells up after it. But let's take a listen to what this sounds like with different release settings, and you can really kind of hear what the release is doing here. So I'm going to start at 2, which is a pretty quick release. That's why it's pumping. I'm going to turn up the release as we're going, and you'll hear that the compression evens out. It's more going to be doing a lot of compression all the time. It's not going to be backing off, and you get a much more even tone, but it kind of takes the vibe and the rawness out of it. So let's hear what that sounds like. So yeah, now it's pretty much just clamped down the whole time. So it still sounds pretty good, but you're not getting that kind of pumping vibe to it, which is what I think Jakir was going for in this particular demo.
That is such a drastic illustration of how the release control affects the present and how it kind of pulls things forward, pushes them back, right? Like it brings that room tone so forward and present in the mix. And that was just the release knob. Like it seems kind of like black magic, right? But like this is really why these settings are so important to make sure they're doing what you want them to do, because this is a choice, right? Like both sounds are fine, but one of them works better for this mix and for the presence that he was looking to add to that room sound.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see he has the mix knob kind of backed off a little bit, which is pretty much anytime I'm doing kind of heavy compression like this, I definitely have the mix knob turned down a little bit, because I don't want it completely squashed and completely compressed. I want a little bit the original transients coming through. So definitely make sure to play around with the mix knob if you're doing kind of this heavy compression style. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so that's kind of a good illustration of what the release knob is doing when you have aggressive compression going. Let me just do an A/B real quick of with and without compression. You can kind of hear the tone changes that it's giving to the kick drum and snare drum in particular. So this is the original bus with the Distressor going. And this is with no bus compression. So yeah, it's like really rounding out the mid-range in that kick drum, really bringing the attack forward a little bit, and kind of tightening it a little bit too. It's a little bit looser and flabby in the uncompressed version, and the compressed version's a little bit tighter, and hitting a little bit harder at a specific frequency range rather than a big woofy thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a really good example of the right time and place to use heavy compression like this.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's the thing where, like, I've seen plenty of people's mixes where, like, the compressor is it's always working. But Matt, you brought up such a good point of, like, the way to, like, if you're feeling like, man, I love the aggression, or I love, like, what it's doing, but 5 minutes later you're listening to your mix, right, and you're like, man, why does everything feel kind of like bunched up or weird? A lot of times that can be the feeling of overcompression on tracks. It can kind of give you your ears and your brain this little, like, oh, why do I feel stressed listening to this mix? Or at least that's how I react whenever I hear overcompression. So I love that you highlighted using that mix knob to kind of just, let's add back a little bit of that uncompressed signal, allow it to breathe a little bit into there. And there's a couple other settings too that, as we dive into these bus compressors, there's other settings that can really help you kind of mitigate the effects of the bus compression. If you're feeling like it's too much, but you like parts of it, but you don't like other parts of it. So this is the important thing, I think, for folks at home to be taking away from what we're talking about here, is like, there's kind of different strategies to get through all these things. But at the end of the day, it's like, how does it sound? How does it feel? Become the two most important questions to ask yourself as you're working on these. So I guess in talking about settings, here's another kind of poll for the audience and you guys here as well. When you're using compression on your mix, ratio wise, Drew, do you lean towards those, like, lower ratios, or do you typically go with a high ratio and just let it kind of almost be a limiter in a way?
Yeah, it depends. The typical answer starts with it depends. So for me, that's one of the things I love about the API. It's got that 1.5 to 1. So yeah, if I'm 100% wet on the compression non-parallel workflows, it's 1.5 or 2 typically. If, however, I am going to, if I think I'm going to be going toward, or if I'm navigating towards a parallel workflow, then you can obviously you can get into the higher ratios because you can dial that back a little bit. So yeah, it's just kind of a two-pronged approach there, depending on what the outcome's going to be.
And how about you, Matt? Do you find yourself sticking to one ratio, or do you kind of play around with this from mix to mix?
Yeah, I definitely play around with it from mix to mix. I usually find myself somewhere in the 2 to 4 range, but definitely lower and higher depending on what the mix calls for. But yeah, I think 2 is probably usually where I start, and then sometimes fiddle around with it from there.
Nice. Well, and then to me, one of the other major ones that really seems to affect how thick or how grabby the bus compressor reacts, obviously that's the attack time. So you'll notice on most of these examples, we've got a fairly relaxed attack time, and what the effect of the attack time has is it's how quickly is the compressor going to react to the signal coming through. So say on, like, drums, right? If you really want to have that smashed, kind of just like, this big solid block of drums, maybe on guitars as well. I'll do this in parallel for vocals. You want this just, like, solid, dense chunk of, like, very highly compressed music to now sneak up underneath the dry signal. That's where you would go with, like, a faster attack. But on a mix, a mix bus or on a group bus, a lot of times I'll find myself kind of keeping this more open at 10, if not 30 millisecond range. And here I'll play my example again, but this time on the 2500, we'll still keep it subtle, but I'll kind of open up the ratio a little bit more and close down the attack a little bit, so you guys can hear what this sounds like with the compressor reacting faster to my program. Make it so we can see the meters. There we go. a little more gain. Now the attack. Turn the feed to you guys here in the headphones a little bit more. There we go. You guys hear the difference when I rotate the attack quickly from 30 back to 0.03?
Yeah, definitely. When you have it on the slower attack, you can hear the transies poking through a little bit more. Then when you have it on the fast attack, everything is just kind of being. It rounds the whole. It
rounds this whole thing out a whole bunch, right? And of course, all these effects are down. You know, I've got my mix knob for this one set at 60%. So all the effect that you're hearing is being mitigated a little bit by letting some of that dry signal through. But sorry, what were you gonna say, Drew?
You know, I was just gonna say that. You know, I was just gonna clarify that. Make sure people understand that the attack time is not a waiting period. It's a phase. So it's not as if you're setting the attack time so that it waits and does nothing during that period, but it's defining the period at which it reaches its maximum state of compression. So it's it's got an arc to it. You know, it's like think of it as a phase and not a waiting period. Just wanted to get that little tidbit out there.
Yeah, because this was the hardest thing for me to understand at a technical level. What's happening inside of compressors, Drew? Right? Is like. You think like attack, it hits this and then it waits 30 milliseconds and then it starts. And it's like it's all variable. It's all kind of happening at the same time. Like you know, it's already kind of maybe in the release stage and it's like wait, I got to attack again. So it's a fully variable thing. It's not a hard and fast thing, which again is I hope another nail in the coffin of like, man, you just got to kind of listen to these things. You don't want to think about this stuff too analytically, and you know. Again, a really strong approach for this sort of stuff, guys, is personally, like I make myself presets. I've got the place that I like to start with the 2500, and then I tweak from there, or I'll go in and I'll steal somebody else's. There's a lot of great mix bus settings, especially for the 2500 or in the SSL. You know, like Jeff Balding's got a bunch of different mix bus settings that you can kind of explore these and learn like what is he doing, and you notice like his attack times and his ratio's low. Attack is really 10 or 30. Like you see the things that a lot of the pros are using on these, and it kind of repeats itself over and over again. But find yourself a place to start and then listen and react and then make changes from there. It's really kind of the only foolproof method to getting a great compressor setting. But while we're in the 2500, there's a couple other things that are unique about the 2500 that I think we should definitely address here. Because attack, ratio, release, threshold, makeup gain, you're gonna see those in basically every compressor. But there's some really interesting and cool things about the 2500 and why I saw it on a lot of people's desert island list at the beginning of the show. Is you've got stuff like the threshold, the knee, which we'll talk about. We got the thrust circuit. You've got your feedback or feed forward, and then left-right link. These are some pretty special settings that really can drastically change the tone of it again. So from the top, the threshold, the knee. This is we've all seen compressor graphs, right? And you can see like it gets to the threshold and then it just turns, right? Like right on the threshold is where it makes hey, here's where we're gonna start compressing. You can kind of soften that transition. And I guess, Drew, how would you describe to people sonically what's happening when you soften up the knee of a compressor?
Yeah, it's a great trick and not trick, but it's a great setting to deal with that allows you to soften some hard compression settings. So due to the fact that it's entering a compressed state early, like i.e. before the threshold, and then not reaching its final compression state until beyond the threshold, it creates a smoothness to it. So let's say you're trying to really clamp down on a vocal and you're using high ratios but it's feeling a little too pumpy for you, then softening that knee, and in the case of a bus, it would hold true as well, that it allows it to more gently. Our ear, what we catch with compression is we catch those fast releases. That's what our ears grab here as pumping, and that's what adds excitement, right? We like that sometimes, but sometimes we want it to be smooth. So softening that knee is a way of softening it. The other thing to realize is that a lot of compressors have a multi-knee, right? LA2s are a great example where they have a quick, a multi-release, and which therefore creates a multi-knee in the way it lets go of things. So if you look at a transfer curve on a compressor, you can kind of envision, and some of them actually have those little bouncy balls, and you can kind of see them moving up and down the transfer curve. And so like the knee you can sort of envision what it's doing at that point, and it just kind of shapes the way that compressor handles the gain. So I don't know.
Makes it for much less stress. Like the way it kind of gets into compression is softer, a little bit more. To me, it always sounds a little bit more transparent, a little less compressed. So yeah,
I think some old school gear would actually call it over easy. Like on some of the old DBX units, it would be labeled, there's an over easy button that would soften the knee, right? So it's kind of like that. Yeah, it's a way of sort of hiding the compression a little bit and smoothing it out.
Well, and then another one, they call it the thrust circuit on the API. You have loud, medium, and normal. And essentially what these are is it's inside the side chain, so it's inside the compressor. It's how it's listening to the material. It tilts the whole mix, so a little bit less. It listens to less lows and more highs, and so what that ultimately ends up doing is like there's less compression based on the kick drum or the bass as you kind of get in the ultimate effect to the user is like it sounds like it's getting thicker. It's getting more and more pushed because of the thrust circuit. So let me play this back for you guys, and we can listen to this in real time. I went back to my settings. No offense to Jeff's, but I'll keep it on my kind of easy breezy settings so we can check out what the different thrust circuits sound like. That one's not super drastic, is it, guys? It's like you can see it in the meters. You can see the meters reacting differently when I go into loud. But to what I'm hearing, I'm not necessarily picking up that difference a ton. And that's really what it is. It is not changing the tone of what you're listening to. It's changing the tone of what the compressor is listening to. So it's going to react a little bit more vividly to high mid sort of material as opposed to just the whole mix more broadly. And then the last one here in the 2500 in the tone circuit is the new versus old. Drew, do you mind explaining to people what feed forward and feedback? We might lose some people really fast here. So try to.
I'll keep it quick. In
the easiest terms possible. What's the difference between these two?
Yeah, this one's a bit of a mind bender because the essential idea here is that on a feed forward design, the sidechain derives its signal path from the input. In other words, before the gain reduction circuit. But on a feedback device, doesn't sound like it should work, but on a feedback compressor, the output is where the sidechain is sourced from. So in other words, the sidechain is impacted by the compression setting. So it sounds like if you're thinking in terms of signal flow, it sounds like, oh, that'd be a feedback. That doesn't make sense. It'd be a feedback loop. But really, it's in essence that the output influences the sidechain. So on the API in particular, when you're in feedback mode, the output gain, as you increase the makeup gain, you will increase the amount of compression because you are increasing the amount of signal being sent to the detection circuit. So I'll stop there in case hopefully that's fast enough. Does that make sense?
I think that makes kind of, but why would that change? Because so essentially when you're in feedback, everything the compressor is doing is informing what the compressor does next, including the makeup gain, including how much it has compressed, correct?
Yeah, so it's like it acts as sort of a throttler, and therefore you can actually use more. Feel free to use more aggressive settings when you're in feedback because of the nature of the detection circuit. It actually sort of mitigates the intensity of it. So you'll notice if you toggle between the two, and it may or may not show in this case, but feedback is going to be in general a little bit more sort of gentle based on the same settings, whereas feed forward is definitely more aggressive. Another way to think of that, like SSL is feed forward. So that's that snappy, right? That snappy aggressive compression that we're used to. Feedback is a little bit more vintage and a little bit more mellower. So yeah, that's kind of the way to think about it.
Let's take a listen and see if you guys can hear the difference here at home as well. Yeah, Dude, I can hear that difference right away. Like the old one, it was a little bit gentler sounding. You could,
Yeah.
I mean, you could see in the meters, but I could also hear the difference coming through too. Of like when it was on the older circuit, it was just a little bit softer, a little bit more flowy with the track. Whereas the best word that you use to describe the feed forward one, a little bit snappier reaction to the music.
It makes perfect sense that the feedback version the detection circuit is being fed by an already compressed signal. So yeah, it's going to mitigate those. It's going to modify or modulate those settings a little bit downward.
Yeah.
What are some situations you would use one over the other, Joe?
Well, I mean, I think, what Ben the AB Ben just did is great because it's one of those instances where the feedback is more gluey. It's a little more gluey and it's a little more vintage and retro-y, whereas feed forward is definitely that more modern, snappy, more aggressive, the needle snapping back kind of thing. But what's cool is because of feedback, you can use more aggressive settings. So when you're in feedback mode, go to 10-1, when you're in feedback mode, go to that super fast release because you know that the architecture of the unit is sort of, you're working with it in tandem with it.
Man, and Drew, you're cementing the point that we kind of spoke about earlier, right? Of like you kind of have to approach bus compressors with like what you think you want it to do, right? You almost had to kind of think about like what's the song I'm mixing, what's the result I want, and knowing from experience of using these tools many times, you start to be like, all right, cool, this is modern pop. I probably want it on the new setting. I'm just gonna leave it normal and go with like a medium neat. Like a lot of these settings I could do with my ears closed, eyes open, ears closed, set it up typically about where I expect it to be, and then tweak it from there. Because like as we were going between feed forward and feed backward just now, my mind instantly was like, oh shit, I'm on feedback. Let me go back. I wanted to go back in and start changing other settings, reacting to what I was now hearing. I was like, oh, now there's more room for to bring the threshold down, to be a little more aggressive with it. So these are, this is a bit of a dance that we all have to do when we're working on these tracks, right? Is like you start with like your preconceived notion of what it should be, and then you listen and react and start tweaking and tuning as you continue to build the mix.
And that's why we have so many of them. That's why we have so many of them, right? It's like that people think, oh gosh, do we need another compressor? Yeah, we do, right? I mean, like, yes, we need more, we do need more because at any given moment, like what I always tell people is like when trying out bus compressors, like it should hit you immediately, right? Put it on there at the factory default, maybe twiddle a couple, fiddle a few knobs, and it should, if it doesn't speak to you, if it doesn't like instantly grab you, then I move on. I'll try something else, like, and that's one of the things, we have such a great library of stuff, and I'm, thankful to use it all these years. And it's like, yeah, that's what it is. It's so easy to fall into a rut. Oh, I always like this one. I like this one. But man, when you can get out of that rut and just go on your immediate reaction, that's always a good thing.
Absolutely. And so that brings us to the last really kind of unique control to the API 2500. And if I remember correctly, guys, there's no other plugin on UAD that has this left-right link. At least not, I guess a bunch of them have left-right link where you can unlink them. Yeah. But the API 2500 is unique in that you can get an in-between setting. So essentially what this is doing, again, this is affecting what the compressor is listening to. So it's making its gain reduction judgments based off its internal sidechain, which we can affect, with the thrust circuit. But another one is the stereo link. So what this is like left and right, what's happening in these two channels at 100%, both sides are getting added together, and then that's what's influencing the threshold. When it crosses that threshold, that's what's going on. As you start pulling these apart, the left and right side compressor, the side chains, they stop kind of listening to the other side. So the left channel is now at 60% listening to what's also happening on the right channel and vice versa. So now the left and right side of my compressor aren't locked together. They're not moving simultaneously. They're allowed to kind of move slightly independently. And this is what's cool about the 2500 is like there's other bus compressors that allow you to unlink left and right, which can be great. It can be also problematic. I'll talk about why in a second. But with the API, we can dial in the exact amount of control for how the left and right side are moving together. And of course, you can go IND, which is independent, means both sides can move fully freely. So why did I mention that? It's good and bad. It's good. It can add a lot of width to a mix. It kind of, left and right not having to compress together. But the one thing to really look out for, and this happens often, especially if you've got a very widely staged mix, is that you can kind of have this like seasick waving side to side effect on your mix where like the kick drum hits in the middle and it pulls everything down, but then a heavy guitar on the right pulls the right side down more, so the kick actually shifts a little bit to the left. So a lot of times this would be characterized by like the snare drum or the lead vocal swimming in the mix. You know, maybe they're panned perfectly in the center, but because you have left and right unlinked, you know, a heavy guitar on the right hand side can cause that side to compress further, and now all of a sudden my vocal sounds like it's leaning to the right, and then a moment later to the left. So if you're ever experiencing that, and I see this a lot on like drum overheads or drum groups, if you unlink the side chain, it can be a cool widening effect, but it can also have this kind of like floating note. You know, you don't have a solid center channel happening anymore. So sometimes I use it, sometimes I don't. As you saw in some of those presets, sometimes it actually does feel really great to go in these in-between zones, like the 60 to 80 kind of range, because you're getting a little bit of independence from the sides. You get a little bit extra stereo width as a result, but you're not getting the seasickness of your lead vocal constantly oscillating between the center channel and leaning a little bit left or right. So yeah, I think that kind of does it for bus compressor controls. I saw a good question happening here in the chat. Someone was asking about, again, about higher ratios. Like when and or why would you go with a higher ratio? And I guess personally, it's kind of like an aggression thing, right? Like if I'm trying to be gentle and nice and kind of, as you guys saw, I'm using multiple stages of compression. I kind of like to keep those all low, so they're all just doing a little bit of work, but not too much. If I was doing like a metal song, rock mix, something that they need to like punch and hurt, that's where I would start looking at those higher ratios. So that way the kick and the bass and any of the, the kind of heavy transient materials, they just, the minute they hit the threshold, boom, they're pushing the mix back. They're making it really kind of work to recover. So to me, that's kind of how I approach higher ratios. Drew or Matt, do you guys any other tips around using a higher ratio on a bus compressor?
Well, for me, I think it's always like compression, like everything, is like squeezing a balloon, So the ratio, all these parameters are interactive. So as you up the ratio, which increases the amount of gain reduction for signals above the threshold, then that means that you're likely going to need to back off the threshold, right? Or the mix knob, right? That's one of the beauties of these modern processors that have this mix knob. That mix knob is like your ultimate, like sort of, safety net. But so as you go to higher thresholds, higher ratios, you're probably going to want to raise that threshold a little bit, right? Just because you can get a little aggressive. So they kind of go hand in hand along with attack. As attack speeds up, threshold generally has to go up, right? As attack slows down, threshold generally has to come down to coincide. So just think about like, don't ever adjust one control on a compressor without contemplating the impact of all of the other parameters, right?
Yes.
It sounds maddening. It sounds maddening, but literally it's like squeezing a balloon,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Nice. Well, so that's a bunch of kind of powerful tips, I think, around the 2500 SSL. A question, I've seen come up in other places, not necessarily you guys, all of our chat, you guys are excellent. You guys are all super knowledgeable. This seems to not be a big sticking point, but I've seen it happen before. People wondering, man, isn't doing all this like bus compression, all this two bus work of compression and EQ, et cetera, isn't this what mastering typically is a question I see a lot of people bring up. And no, the mastering is a different process, and and using, but again, I see a lot of, especially newer engineers, they kind of get a little self-conscious about what settings they're using on their bus, or they think they might be doing too much. I guess my personal take on it is like, if you love how your mix sounds going through these things, that's it. You love it. Like, that's your mix. That's what you should deliver to the client, to the mastering engineer. You've done it. You've made something that you like and that your client likes. If you're not confident, it's not too hard to just make another bounce, disable these couple of things and give them, if you trust that mastering engineer more than you trust yourself for those sorts of things, hand them something without the bus compressor. But to me, this is, I talked about at the beginning of the show, this is how I start all my mixes. And I think, a lot of us do here. Like, this is, the first thing I do before I even start thinking about soloing or EQing an individual track or doing anything else. It's like, let me get the two bus, like my preconceived notion of where I think this should sit. Let me get that two bus kind of working in there. So now I'm doing, all my decisions are being made through these boxes. because it's not so much we've said this multiple times now. It's not just a level thing; it's a tone thing. So mixing into these tools the whole time informs everything else upstream from there. But Drew, do you take the same standpoint of like mixed buses are not mastering and vice versa?
Yeah. I'll push back a little harder in the sense that anybody that tells you that adding a bus compressor and a bus equalizer is mastering and should be left to the master engineer, then just get some new friends, because that's not it's not a thing, right? Mixing, bus compression has always been and will always be the purview of the mix engineer. It's not mastering. Mastering, as you mentioned, I think the biggest things I always like I like to say about mastering is that it's a process separate and apart from mixing, typically done by a different person in a different room on different monitors. And we could talk for hours about why all four of those things are important. But yeah, this is definitely not that. As you mentioned, Ben, yeah, if you're not confident, then yeah, by all means, feel free to back off. But I would just encourage people to, just do it, right? Do it. Send if you have a good relationship with a master engineer, they'll say, hey, do you think maybe what's your bus compression situation on this mix, right? It feels a little over compressed to me. That's part of the mastering process, is that relationship between the mix engineer and the mastering engineer. So if you're a mixer out there and you're just getting started, experiment with this stuff that like Ben showed you, and then reach out to a mastering engineer and create that relationship and say, hey, I'm gonna send you a master, but I'm gonna send you a mix to get mastered, and I want to get your opinion on it. Like, mastering engineers love that. They love when the mix engineer says, hey, give me some feedback, give me some notes on this mix. That's part of that relationship, for sure.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think it's important to not try to make your two-bus compressor do the job of mastering. Don't try to slam into it so hard that you're trying to get loudness out of it, which is something you would usually do in mastering. Definitely, you usually want to keep it a little more subtle, and so that the mastering engineer has more room to work. But at the end of the day, you want to do whatever sounds good, whatever makes the sound of the record, and that's the most important thing.
You guys brought up such important points there, and I want to call out a trick for doing that. And Fab called this trick out in the Tales from the Switch series. A great way to always make sure you guys are leaving headroom, and I know everyone, you always want to deliver your mastering engineer headroom if you can. A great way to keep yourself from over mixing things, from overdoing it, is to start with a peak limiter at the very end of your main, at the end of your two-bus chain. So just like mixing those two-bus compressors, what I'll do is I'm using the FabFilter Pro L for this today. I just start with 6 dB. That's it. And I've used the 6 dB trick for 12 years now. It literally every single mix I've ever done, there's a 6 dB limiter at the end of it, so then when I go to mastering, literally all I do is I just bring this down to 0. I still let it go through it, just I don't want to deliver any peaks or anything like that if I've kind of accidentally gone too far. But that 6 dB headroom advantage is typically all I need to be able to have enough room to deliver a solid sounding mix with room for the mastering engineer to still do their work.
So it's like setting your alarm clock. It's like setting your clock 15 minutes fast so you get up on time in the morning.
That's it.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly it, Drew. I did see a question in the chat, someone asking about, we spent a lot of time talking about the SSL, talking about the API 2500. Someone was asking about, wait, what about the 33609?
Yeah,
this is a great one, man.
And 2254, its brother, right? The 2254.
Yep, the two brothers Neve. So what I really love about this one, and the fans of the 33609 will already know this, is that it is essentially 2 dynamic processes in one place, right? You got a compressor and a limiter that you get to play with. So you can use, and I use this all the time to be able to do a soft, gentle, 1.5 or 2-to-1 ratio on the compressor. Give it a really fast recovery, and then just again use it to tickle the meters a little bit here. Maybe go for a slow attack, and then come back over to the limiter, which is it's a fixed ratio. It's a limiter. Again, a lot of times for a mix bus, I'm going to go slow attack, fast release, and again just use this to kind of add a little bit more, and this kind of just it rounds out the top end of the transients in a really nice way. But you'll notice there's some features here that are similar but different, right? Like you've got, especially in this is the updated 33609. You now have a sidechain filter, which is kind of similar, not the same, but sort of similar to that thrust circuit.
Yeah, it's just the low end reduction. It's not the top end, tilt. It's not the tilt filter like those are.
And then you've got the stereo link or unlink. So, working in stereo mode, the needles are moving together. Go into mono mode. Now left and right are able to listen independently. So you do get it.
It's also a diode bridge. It's also a diode bridge architecture, that and the Zener, the Chandler Zener is like that in the 2254. So they're completely different flavors of compression. So that they're definitely worth checking out.
The tone is a night and day tone different. The thickness of the 3369 doesn't. There's nothing else that sounds as thick and gooey as the 3369. In fact, for me, like sometimes it's a little too gluey. It's a little it's a little bit too thick. So I'll either swap it out for something a little bit a little bit more forward, like the 2500, or I'll come in here and just use it for what it's good at, and then use the mix knob, to just kind of blend in some of the dry signal. So I'm getting the thickness, and I can kind of overdo it a bit. This is really the number one control for me on any compressor these days is having the mix knob. So I can overdo it. I can kind of go nuts. I can again make a solid block of beautiful, crunchy, compressed audio. But then I can hedge my bets a little bit and allow through some of the uncompressed signal at the same time. It's super important. But I wanted to give a shout out to 3369 because it's a fantastic bus compressor, which I think kind of leads us into the section here that we want to talk about. We want to talk about mistakes and then how to pick a bus compressor. I guess I maybe preempted us. Let's talk about picking bus compressors, and then we'll get into we'll finish out with the mistakes. Drew, I guess, when it comes to picking compressors, you just mentioned the topology, the fact that the Neve are diode bridge compressors versus VCA compressors like a SSL or, a op amp driven 2500. There's tubes, there's transformers, there's a lot of different architectures.
Yeah.
Why
it goes back to what we were saying earlier.
Difference?
Yeah, it goes back to what we were saying earlier about why do we need more compressors? Yes, if everyone had stopped making compressors in 1980, right, we wouldn't have these cool modern tools, And it's so everyone is different, right? The VCAs are generally that more modern, snappy sound. The tube ones, we didn't talk too much about the Fairchild, although we did a deep dive on the Fairchild 670, so you can look on our previous streams to find that. We went really deep into that, and that's a topology that mega tube topology. Your audio is going through multiple transformers, multiple tubes. So yeah, that's a good point to make that I don't know if we've made today, and just that all of these processors are equal parts functionality and sonics, right? They do stuff, right? They have parameters and they do compress, but they have sonic footprints. So the reason why we need all of these is because at any given moment we might want a different thing, right? The 176 somebody mentioned as a bus compressor. It's not really known as a bus compressor because it has such radical fast attack time. We're talking, 20 microseconds, sub 1 millisecond. So it's not generally thought of as a bus compressor. But the thing is if your mix is kind of thin and kind of spiky and has lots of transients, it could be just the ticket, right? It could be just the ticket, right? That's the thing about all of this is you cannot have these preconceived notions because you never know what might work at any given day. And a lot of that is based on that topology, because the actual circuitry matters and it impacts things in a multitude of ways that we love, and we can't live without.
Right. How about you, Matt? What's your major consideration when you're kind of picking between the multitude of bus compressors at your disposal?
Yeah, definitely tone is part of it, but also, a big part of my workflow is mixing into bus compressors, and part of that is I usually go with ones that I'm familiar with because, especially with two bus compressors, you can kind of judge the whole gain structure of your mix based on how hard you're hitting that two bus compressor, especially if you're really familiar with that particular compressor. Mm-hmm. So I tend to reach for things that I'm really familiar with, like the SSLG or the API 2500. But like Drew was saying, I'll usually start somewhere where I'm familiar with, but if that's not doing it for me, I'll definitely swap it out and just kind of go through the list and try different things, because everything, even if it's doing the same amount of compression, the same attack time, same release time, each of the compressors are still going to sound different and add a different vibe to the sound. So I usually start with the ones I'm familiar with and then kind of experiment from there if it's not working.
Nice. Yeah, that's a great question here. Storm Surf was asking, can you spread the bus compression over multiple compressors to pull in different colors? You nailed it. Yeah. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And it was even the first example I showed, we had the 2500 into an EQ and then into the SSL G bus. So I was using both to taste, just to get a little bit of the API flavor, a little bit of how it reacts to things, and then also get the SSL. And to both Matt and Drew's point, they're super comfortable for me. Those are ones that like I've used so many times that like I know them like the back of my hand. I know what each control is going to do. But when I hear over compression, I'm like, all right, which one's moving too much? All right, am I gonna, how am I gonna address what I'm hearing? Am I gonna back off the mix knob? Am I gonna bring the threshold up? There's so many ways to drive to the same result that it comes down to experience and comfortability with these compressors. But I do want to call out, man. There's kind of a flip side to this of like, if you're ever feeling a little bit stuck, or you feel like you're kind of like, man, I always just pull up my template and I put the tracks through the template and then I call it a day, and like I think it sounds good, but like if you ever had that back of your head kind of feeling like, is there something better out there? Is there a way I could do that? Is there something new that I should try? Trying something different every once in a while, like throwing in say you never use a Fairchild on your mix bus. You may find, even though you're doing a pop song, running it through the Fairchild, it seems counterintuitive, but it might be like the thing it needed to give it a different character, a different vibe that you didn't have going into it. So like this is, roll with what you're comfortable with. Always, tweak to your heart's content. But end of the day, like never feel like you're tied into like, oh, I can only use this one. I only know this one compressor. There's so many options and so many different tones and styles and sounds that you can get out of these bus compressors. There's a reason why we can do an entire episode just talking about bus compressors, because they're like that major of an impact on mixes, and it's that important that we really, really want you guys to know, or just be thinking about this sort of stuff and listening and evaluating for yourselves what sounds good to you and what sounds good for your mixes and for your clients. So with that, man, let's talk about mistakes. let's cap this off with like the mistakes that we've all made using bus compressors. So I mean, number one mistake is not using a bus compressor.
Yeah, right.
Right?
Or using the same one all the time, like you were just saying.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And it's, Drew, like when we were talking about this last week, like you were like, dude, think about it, man. Every record that we've listened to, every popular music record that we've listened to, since the Beatles, they've all had bus compressor. There's always
I would imagine so. Yeah. Yep. I would imagine so.
And almost like you can. Yes, maybe there's like 2
I'm
or
gonna
3%.
leave out. Yeah. I was gonna say I'll leave out. Let's leave open the opportunity, because there's some people that say that there are purists who act like, oh, you shouldn't need it or you shouldn't have it. So we'll leave them their space. We'll carve them out a little bit of space. But yeah, the vast majority of what you've heard, especially since the early '80s when SSL started putting bus compressors right into the console, right? That was kind of a new thing in, I don't know, 82, 83. So it's been with us for that long, this idea of that it's right there, people get used to it. Heck, I mean, when I worked on SSL consoles and I was tracking, I would put it on during tracking just to make stuff sound exciting. When, the band came back in for a playback, it's like, well, hell yeah, of course I'm going to put that on there, and put it on the big monitors and they just came out of a room where they were blasted with headphones. They want the most exciting version of that. So yeah, I would say, definitely not using one. And then the other thing is, I know you two guys are advocates of top-down mixing, and I'll just, I'm depending on, with some of my students, I sometimes advocate for bottom-up mixing, right? So I'll just counter some of that top-down thought process with a bottom-up approach in that, sometimes for some people, it might be better to challenge themselves to get stuff without bus processing as good as it can. And then when you add the bus processing, you really do appreciate what it does bring to the table. The one thing, the danger with top down is that if I start with the compression, my mix depends on the compressor. And that can sometimes be a little bit of a problem, where you don't want to bypass your 2-bus chain and have your mix fall apart, right? Whereas with bottom up, when you bypass the 2-bus chain, you still have what you had for the majority of the mix. It's now just hopefully better. So definitely try both ways. First mixing into it, which would be your top down type approach, or bottom up, adding it at the end. Like I recommend with some students to add it at the 80% mark, because it's like, all right, I've challenged myself to get it as good as I possibly can without it. And then when I add it, it becomes, this like special sauce, and you can maybe appreciate it that way. So just a little counter thought there.
Mm-hmm. Seeing a lot of, got a nice reaction there from the chat, talking about, especially calling out Andrew Sheps, who's, kind of changed. He's flown through, I've known Andrew, I've gotten to work with him on some tutorials back over at Pure Mix, and knowing how he likes to approach compression, you guys are calling it just right. Like it's a lot of parallel compression, the rear bus, like the doing bits of compression all along the chain, so that when he gets to the end, he doesn't need a bus compressor as much because he's kind of intertwined that throughout it. And I'm glad you guys are bringing up parallel compression because guess what? In 2 weeks, we're going to have a show similar to this. We're going to dedicate a whole show to parallel compression, parallel processing just in general. So there's a lot more to talk about there that we'll get to in a couple of weeks. But I guess another quote unquote mistake, again, this is art. There's no mistakes. There's just happy accidents, is too much compression. So I guess, Drew, do you mind kind of talking us through like, what does too much compression sound like? What is it actually a bad thing to have, or is it something that can actually be good? And Matt kind of showed some heavy-handed, but let's talk about like, what the effect of too much compression can be.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, what if it sounds good to you, it is good, right? We have to just start there, right? Yep. Because, like you said, Ben, this is art, and there's nobody can tell you what you're doing is, whatever. There's not a right answer here. But you also alluded to this earlier, was the fatigue factor, right? And just coming off of a parallel discussion, and what we'll be talking about a lot next in that show is that standard downward compression at 100% is in fact manipulating all transients, right? There's just no way around it. And sometimes that heavy manipulation of transient, especially with really fast attack times, that's if you feel like you're compressing too much, first thing to do, slow down the attack, lighten the ratio. Generally, you'll get yourself out of that bind pretty quickly. But yeah, it's because you're robbing the transient. So there's a fatigue factor here. There's that's generally when you can tell that you're doing it when you feel like you've lost punch, right? You're trying to add punch with compression, right? And to feel like you're losing it is likely too much and or too fast of attack times. So that's, I would say those are your key factors, and the ways to fix them is primarily that ratio and attack, and then of course that you've squozen the balloon. Is that a word? Squozen? I don't know. But yeah,
squeezed it.
But you've squeezed it, squozen, whatever. You got to adjust other things as you do those things. So,
right. And so you brought up, another one I hear a lot of times, like, having the kick kind of punch down the mix, which sometimes it can be an effect. And, we just coming off of the sidechain show, right? Where like, it was a choice to use the kick to sidechain compress basses or synths. It can be, you can go for a very obvious, like, hey, nothing matters but the kick drum on the downbeat, boom, everything disappears and it comes back to life. That can be a cool movement thing, right? Like that can be an effect and something that is very emblematic of certain genres of music.
Yeah, it can be.
But on other songs, like if you got a pop song and like every time the kick drum hits, like the guitars disappear, or like, you get to the bridge where the drums let up and all of a sudden you now hear the vocals, and then as soon as the chorus kicks in, the music, it gets smaller. This is the ultimate effect that to me bugs me when I hear it in my own mixes or other people's mixes, is when like the chorus hits and it feels like everything gets smaller. Yeah, it's usually a bus compressor doing too much work, or like that's where I would start immediately opening those things up. I mean, I would immediately go bypass if it's my mix and I feel like the chorus is getting smaller. I go hunting on my mix bus. I'm like, all right, who's responsible for this? This is a travesty, and I will not stand for it. Start bypassing the bus compressors and be like, oh, it's my SSL bus compressor. I open it up. I look at it. You see the meters, it's at like -10, and I'm like, oh, that explains a lot. And most of the time, it's like if you're mixing into these things, like I'll not think about my bus compressor for an hour or two, and then suddenly I'll have a feeling or reaction of like, why is my chorus small? Go hunting. Oh, it's this compressor. Oh, wow. I haven't adjusted that threshold since I started this mix. Let's open that puppy back up. Let's maybe go into the headroom control, go to the mix knob. Just like Drew said, there's so many different solutions to each one of these problems. It's impossible to just say, do this one thing to fix it. But what's most important is that you guys are listening to what you're doing and reacting and feeling it, and then taking action on that. And
that the sidechain the high pass on the sidechain. If you switch over to my screen, Ben, real quick, this is something that's been going on for a long time. This is a compressor, an analog compressor that I have. It's an Allen Smart C2, and as you can see, it actually has this external sidechain button where you can engage the external sidechain, and you could buy these cables, and inside of the cables were filters built into them. Wow. So this is a sidechain cable. It's a sidechain high pass filter that you would buy these Y cables for, And now your signal would come in, and the side chains would be fed with a version of your mix with a 120 hertz, right? Like if you're wondering where do I put the high pass, the side on my, the side chain high pass on my bus compressor, 120 hertz is a good one. It's been around, the SSL smart compressors have done that. And then you engage the external side chain. And now you're using an analog mix bus compressor that doesn't contain a high pass filter, but now you've got 120 hertz high pass filter in the analog, the external side chain of the detection circuit. So this has been around for many, many decades. This is not something. It's great that we've gotten into these plugins with mix knobs and that have these features. But even in the analog old days, people came up with solutions, which is pretty cool to see that filter in a cable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's awesome. It just goes to show how lucky we are to have these variable sidechain filters in pretty much every bus compressor we have.
Yeah, 100%.
We're so spoiled nowadays.
We are. Well, but yeah, so there you go. It's been around for a while.
Well, I saw another one. Funk brought this up. He was saying I like to gain stage before compression. That kind of was another one we had here on the list. Right, was kind of getting the sweet spot right with gain staging. So Drew, do you mind kind of talking a little bit about how do you coach folks to get their gain staging correct in relation to bus compressors?
Yeah, well, one thing is like that trick, the trick that you mentioned, the 6 dB trick is really helpful. Like if you don't trust yourself, or if you're not as if you want a little hand, that trick is great. Otherwise, it's just about watching your meters. I mean, it sounds boring. It sounds like a simple answer, but it's true, right? It's literally just understanding. One thing to understand is that in the digital realm, generally speaking, negative 18 dBFS is about the same as, most equipment is calibrated such that, negative 18 is 0 dB on a VU meter. Speaking of VU meters, that's another great way. If you don't want to use the trick, get a good VU meter. There's plenty of free ones out there, and mix with a VU meter on your mix bus. And VU meters are interesting in that they take into account frequency content, right? So if something's really bass heavy, they'll read that, they'll react to that. And so that can be really handy. But even just the visual of being on a VU meter is that little bit of helping hand that because you would never pin VU meters, but there's plenty of people who are working on DBFS meters in your standard DAW, and the tendency is, I'm not clipping, everything's okay. But if you were to look at that on a VU meter, the VU meters would be pinned and not moving. So if you were on a real console, you would never do that. So using the VU meter is a good trick to do that. And of course, the beauty, we have the benefit nowadays of having our headroom screws, in our plugins, where this is what this guy's all about, right? Having the ability to, and maybe you get yourself into a little bit of trouble, right? And the compressor's not feeling right, then you can dial back up or down the headroom screw, right? We've talked about these quite a lot in the Fairchild video. We mentioned it as well. For example, in the Fairchild video, I take the headroom screw and I peg it because I just want to drive as much signal into that model as I can, because it just sounds so glorious, especially on vocals. SSL, not so much. You don't get a benefit necessarily for driving into the model that way. So sometimes if you get yourself into trouble, you can back off. It's nice to have that headroom screw to be able to back off with. But yeah, it's really just about good gain staging from the get-go, which starts with recording at good, modest levels, appropriate levels, understanding that negative 18 concept. And, it's tough nowadays because a lot of virtual instruments and a lot of sound libraries and loops are designed, they come at 0 dBFS. So often one of the first things you got to do is take your VIs, take your loops, knock them down 6 dB, right? To give yourself a fighting chance. But yeah, so it's just it's a combination approach, I think, to gain staging.
Well, and another great tip I've given a couple times before, and still I hold true to this one, is using your bus compressors as your VU meters in a way. So to explain that, essentially what I would do is I would come in and a lot of times my mixes I end up with my threshold up on the positive side, closer to the top. But sometimes what I'll do is I'll optimistically start my mix with the threshold here at 0. So this is, technically at 0 dB, and this is kind of the SSL sweet spot, right around 0 VU. So where I would be hitting 0 on a VU meter, that's this 0 by default on here. And in digital terms, it's minus 18 dBFS. But we're getting to this weird, averages versus peaks. We're not going to talk about that right now. The trick, the hack here is to start with your bus compressor at your intellectually the settings you kind of think you want, right? I want my attack wide open. I'm assuming I'm going to compress 2 or 3 dB, so I'll give myself some makeup gain. A 4-to-1 sounds nice. So I would start with like my ideal self. I would love to end up here, and then I start mixing, and I start pushing stuff into it. And typically, I'll start working on the drums or the bass, and I'll be like, "Man, this feels." I start getting that like scrunchy face. Like, why does everything feel like it's so compressed and like I'm in this tiny little box? Oh yeah, and I remind myself my SSL compressor is still on its default 0 dB. So now I have 2 options. I can come in here, I can just raise the threshold, no penalty. That's fine. But this gives me a gauge of like how much past 0 dB VU am I pushing things. The compressor is what's telling me, hey man, you're really pushing past 0. You're way above where 0 VU would be. You're getting aggressive with it. That's I want that to be an intentional choice. If it's like a softer ballad or a jazz or acoustic song, I definitely want to stay on the lower side of that, on that sweet spot. I want to stay in the lower end of the gain range. And again, this is a great indicator to yourself of like, am I in the right sweet spot area, or am I way below it or way above it? Using the threshold control to kind of help you tell where you're at. To me, it's a very powerful and very effective way of doing this. And you guys can see, I'm sure, in this mix, you can see I've taken the headroom screwed back by 1. I've used a little bit less of the mix. I've sidechain fit. Like I've used every trick I can to like kind of ease up on the amount of compression as I've gone through this mix process for this song. So it's one of those things that like you really knowing the tools and then listening, reacting. That's kind of end of the day the only thing that matters when it comes to bus compressors.
Yeah.
Any other mistakes
I guess
on our list?
Yeah, we got one more that I wanted to highlight, and that is that's obviously interrelated to the gain staging thing, but this is an important one, and it's to make sure that you're level matching, right? When we're doing these comparisons, right? And Ben's stuff was done well, right? Like the whole idea that when you're toggling the mix bus in and out, the mix bus comp in and out, the fact that there's not a huge level discrepancy, that's key, right? That is super clutch that you do that, because you don't want to fool yourself. Too much makeup gain. And in other words, a compressor is not there to fix gain staging mistakes, right? So if you bypass your compressor and there's a huge level jump up or down, right, then you don't have your makeup gain set straight, set right, because the idea is that you want the level matching is super important. Too much and you'll trick yourself into thinking that because more volume sounds better, and then too little. And you're obviously just knocking down the transients, and you're not hearing what's actually happening to the what the compressor is doing and what it's adding to the equation. So you really want to make sure that you're level matching properly. So when that compressor goes in and out, there's not a huge level disparity, and it allows you to say, oh, well, that bump in thickness and that bump in bottom end is legit, right? It's harmonic. It means something. It's not because I've bumped it up 2.5 dB louder than it should be, and Fletcher Munson kicks in, and I think it's louder than it sounds better to me because it's louder. So level matching is key there to make sure when you turn them on, turn them off, there should not be a radical level adjustment. You don't want to trick yourself. And
I'll say it again. Don't trick yourself into thinking that it sounds great just because it's louder, guys. You do want it, and so this can be tricky especially if you're a little newer to mixing and you're still getting comfortable with like what really. Because again, I'll go back to our examples here. That's the tone is shifting as well as the level here. So you can be like, wow, like a lot of times what I'll do is the most important elements of the mix. Those are what I want to kind of hold constant level wise. So I'm talking kick, snare, vocal, bass, guitars maybe, but like the center and the most important elements of my mix, that's what I'm using to evaluate the loudness. Because sometimes when I kick in the bus compressor, the guitars kind of come more forward, but the vocals staying where it's at, right? Like that was the effect I wanted. And then other times, like I want to be able to push these things back, so I'll use the makeup gain to pull everything back forward again. Like it's a very delicate balancing act, but the number one takeaway here is like you can't adjust your makeup gain based on what you see on the meters, because there's other factors besides the gain reduction metering. Like it's giving you an idea of where it's at, but with the mix knob, with the sidechain filter, with these other variables, including the attack and release, you can't just go, oh, I'm at -4, I need 4 dB of makeup gain. You might not be as level mashed as you think you are.
It's not that simple.
It's not that simple, and you ultimately want it to be, again, treat these things like a tone box rather than so much of a level controller. Because level control, that's your faders, that's your limiters, that's your things that are kind of like doing your final levels. And I think I saw a comment earlier in the show, people asking about, what really does kind of affect the levels. And man, it's the balance, it's the faders. The biggest and most important thing in a mix is your levels, your pans. Those are the things that really, if you want your drums to sound like they're loud and hard, you got to turn the faders up. And then where bus compressors play into that is now if you're mixing into a drum bus, into a mix bus, into a limit, if you're mixing into all these things, you making a 2-3 dB push on a fader for, say, like a chorus to make the drums hit even harder, you're pushing up 3 dB here, but the end result at the end of your mix, it may only come up 1-2 dB, but it's now activated everything else and given it that much more push and punch and energy. So that's, again, why I'm such a huge fan of using bus compressors, is I'm allowed to, it kind of frees me up upstream to go be bolder and push things harder and be more dynamic with my mixes, because I got this bus compressor that I'm pushing into. It's helping me keep everything about in the right zone and with the tone that I'm looking for a mix. And that is my rant on bus compressors.
Well,
this whole show is a rant, right?
I know.
This whole show is one big rant.
But guys, I hope this has been helpful for everybody at home. Judging by the comments, it looks like it has been. I've seen lots of people jump in, although as we've gone on today. So I hope you guys found this discussion about bus compressors useful. If you have questions that we didn't get to, drop a comment in on the video. We'll either touch on it next week, or we'll respond to you directly in the comments as well. Because
come to the forum. Yeah, you could always come to uadforum.com and ask follow-up questions there as well.
Yep, absolutely. And as always, guys, we want to hear from you guys. The music at the beginning of the show, the images from the beginning of the show, those are all powered by you guys at home watching. So if you've got music, hit us up live at uaudio.com. Send us an MP3 of the song that you want us to feature. A little list about how UA gear was used in making it. And if you've got some cool studio shots, there's 2 hashtags now. First hashtag is just hashtag universal audio. That's how we find most of our photos. But specifically, if you want to be in next week's studio showdown, if you want to go head to head with another office hours viewer, use hashtag UA office hours. And when Instagram and Facebook are back up online, we'll find your photos. We'll put 2 of them head to head and resume competition next week with the studio showdown. And make sure you guys are subscribed to the YouTube channel. Turn on the notification bell so that way your phone rings when we go live and you can hang out with us. You can ask questions and be a part of these live shows along with us. And I think that's it, guys. Everybody, thank you so much for joining in, for hanging out with us, for geeking out on bus compressors. Something that we could probably do a 6-hour show about bus compressors.
Oh my God,
honestly.
yeah,
we
sure.
could go through. We can
For
go.
sure.
We could spend time on each one of them, talking about the things that we love about them. There's lots of uniqueness. There's a lot of different flavors to experiment with. But at the end of the day, it's finding stuff that you like, stuff that works for the music you're working on, and just makes you a happier mixer, makes your clients more excited about their music. That's all that really matters, guys. So yeah, with that, everybody, we'll see you guys back here next week. Next week, I believe, is mid-side processing tips, tricks, techniques. We're gonna have some fun with that. We're gonna have some fun.
Yeah.
It's gonna be all about stereo. So everybody, bring your headphones next week, because we're gonna be taking stuff outside the speakers, and we're gonna be turning some heads. It's gonna be a lot of fun. And until then, guys, everybody have a great week. We'll see you guys back here next Monday. Peace.
See ya.
Peace.